Well, positively, there's at least two people waiting. It's good.
Mm.
You can see the attendees. There's two there. Fine. Should we just press start?
Yeah, might as
And
well.
then you can crack on. So that's what they'll see, obviously. And that's that. Start. So they'll say once you click start, then you can join this webinar. You're gonna say something like recording. Yeah, because it's recorded it twice.
What should I do sort of in between the hour sort of thing?
I
It's
would
like two different things, really.
I would just switch from one to the other. So just that's it. Just go from one to the
Cool,
next.
yeah.
I've actually told the students that if they want, they can just join both.
Mhm.
But the point is, you're doing an easier thing than an harder thing.
Yeah.
If they want to join both, fine, just switch from one to the next. Is that okay?
Yeah, it's fine.
Just message me if you need anything.
That's fine.
But I will be back. I'm doing nothing at 9. Then go.
Mm.
Use it. Fine.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, let's see. What do we miss?
Okay, we might as well make a start then. I know it's 1 minute early, but well, what? Why not? So hi to everyone who's never met me before. I'm Mr. Cock. I teach at the Leeds branch of Steps to Success. And this is going to be basically an ongoing series of um, improving your English skills. So from sort of 7 to 8, we'll do sort of the easier basic skills, learning some new words, helping with creative writing, how to sort of understand how to use new words, that sort of thing, how to put them into a sentence, how to do comprehension questions and how to understand character motivations, all that sort of thing. And then from 8 till 9, we're going to start looking at the more specific GCSE skills. So ones that are required for your English language GCSE. So including the comprehension skills, the language analysis, the structural analysis, how to write an opinionated essay, that sort of thing. But today, to start our series from 7 till 8, we're going to focus on some keywords and looking at how to begin to understand what new words might mean. But I thought we'd start with just looking at basically exploring the idea of why English is important in the first place. Because I know a lot of people come here and don't always come with the best view of English as a subject. Whether that's because, English is not everyone's first native language, whether it's because you don't enjoy English, because it's opinion-based, whatever that might be, English is important. It is one of the two subjects that if you fail, you have to resit. And yeah, I think we should teach more of it here because it can be fun. If you get into it, if you get into the gist of what English is all about, it can be a very enjoyable experience. So, English is very important, but why is it important? I mean, first and foremost, you will need it in pretty much nearly everything that you do in life. People think you don't, but you do. Let me tell you, as someone who went from GCSEs to A level to a university degree, I can, with 100% certainty, tell you that English is the thing I've used most in my life. That's including my science, considering I did a science degree. It's very important, especially in the job place, in your career. So, for example, in my career, I've needed it for presenting skills, to do presentations. I've made grant presentations. I've talked in front of large audiences, presenting scientific data. All of that requires a basic level of English conversation. Things like social aspects, the nuances of the language. The thing I find most tricky about English, and it's probably one of the most confusing things, is that there are a lot of nuances. And that's kind of what we're going to begin to think about later. In the 8 to 9 session, we'll think about tone and how things can be said in different ways to what they actually mean. And I think that kind of adds to the confusion of English but also what makes it more fun. So, social aspects, between friends, between colleagues, with your boss, with your family, everything to do with English is very important, and you will need it in later life. Even your things in terms of your job, you may need it for writing up data, writing up reports, whether that's scientific data, whether that's finance, whether that's being a doctor, you'll need to be able to have good academic writing. So English is very important on multiple aspects. Okay. But I thought today we will start with looking at the basics of thinking about how you can understand new words. And the goal is what I hope you take from today is you've learned some new words. And I challenge you by the end of this session to be able to go to your friends and your family and start putting these words into practice, because I've tried to pick out words that I think are relatively common. They're a bit higher level, but they're still things that you would use in everyday life. So let's begin to think about how we can use the rest of the sentence to maybe understand what these keywords mean. So firstly, the scientist meticulous notes ensured that the experiment could be repeated exactly. We can use the rest of the sentence to begin to work out what this keyword meticulous means. If we think about the context of the sentence, because this is really what it's all about, it's about context, the bits that aren't said. Ensure that the experiment could be repeated exactly. If something is to be repeated, if we think about our scientific knowledge, and we think about what you might have learned in biology about experimentation, we repeat things for validity. We repeat them so that they can be repeated accurately. Accurately. Accurate repetition. So when someone does something meticulously, we can infer that it is done with the utmost detail and precision. Because if you think about being in a scientific setting, imagine if I was doing a science experiment and somebody had labeled the concentrations of my acid wrong. My whole experiment will be off. So we need detail and we need precision in order to make that thing valid and repeatable. So doing something meticulously is doing something with detail and precision. And I chose this word because I think it comes under a lot of academic context. So it's doing something with detail, I add the word care in there, detail, care, and precision. Okay. Number 2. After being lost in the desert for days, the hikers were parched and desperate for water. So again, the contextual part of this is if we look at this desperate for water, kind of tells us everything that we need to know. If you were in the desert and you were underneath the hot sun all day, you'd be sweating, you wouldn't have any access to water, you would be desperate for water. So the idea that someone is parched simply means that they are extremely thirsty. I think the rest of the sentence tells us that. So it's someone who is extremely thirsty. So he glared at his opponent with narrowed eyes and clenched fists. Let's begin to unpack the context of the rest of this sentence. In normal life, let's start with our clenched fists. Because there's not many scenarios, or at least I would hope, that you would approach a situation with clenched fists. If you did, it might give you the idea that maybe we are dealing with some sort of violent event. And what things do we associate, or what emotions do we associate with violence? Again, I would hope not a common occurrence, but something that we could associate with violence is this feeling of anger or frustration. And so if we begin to unpack this backwards, if you were to glare at somebody, we could infer that we do it with anger and frustration. So it is basically this idea of looking at someone in anger and frustration. But we can pick this even further apart, looking at this idea of the narrowed eyes. Again, if we kind of add this to the idea that you're angry, you're frustrated, you're clenching your fists, In what context would somebody look with narrowed eyes? It might be, again, out of anger, but it's when you're staring at somebody, when you're holding eye contact. If you narrow your eyes, it's a deliberate choice. So we can say that glaring is specifically a variation of staring at somebody with anger. So staring in anger or frustration. Okay, number 4. She was reluctant to hand over her phone after being caught texting in class. I know we've all been there. I even hold my hands up with it, and I hope you haven't, but if you have, I would understand if you were reluctant to. So, obviously, a phone is your possession. It's something that you don't want to hand over. I imagine in that scenario, I was like this at school. If somebody wanted or tried to take something off of me that was mine, I would be reluctant to give them it, meaning that I wouldn't want to hand it over. So this idea of reluctance is essentially the idea that you really don't want to do something, or you do it with hesitation. You do it with this feeling behind it of trepidation, this feeling that it's like a bit worried at the same time. So this idea of reluctance is really not wanting to do something or being hesitant. So not wanting to or hesitating. Hesitating. So I kind of hope that you're starting to see where I'm going with this. If we put ourselves into the scenario of the sentence, we can use our experiences and our emotions that we would get in that scenario to begin to work out what these words mean. And we're going to come later in the session to start to use these words and see them in context. And hopefully you'll begin to memorize them and see how they can be used. So number 5, the magician's final trick left the audience bewildered and gasping in amazement. Imagine you've gone to a magic show and you've seen the most amazing trick. Someone has vanished in front of your very eyes. There's a cloud of smoke and suddenly someone is no longer there. I guess you'd be feeling all sorts of emotions, but mainly, I guess you'd be feeling confused. You'd be thinking, how has that been done? Where's that person gone? All of these questions will be racing through your mind, trying to work out how it was done. So if we work backwards from there and we look at the words gasping and amazement, people gasp purely because they are confused. They gasp because they're surprised. It's this shock that comes with it. So gasping is this idea of shock, confusion, surprise, and even says there, amazement. So amazement, obviously, is when you're so in awe and you're so like, wow, how was that done? I'm so impressed is sort of the vibe we're going for. So putting those things together, you're impressed, but you're confused, and that is what bewilderment is. It is immense confusion stemming from something positive. So it is immense confusion. Confused beyond belief, I guess you could say. Okay, number 6, despite the coach's pep talk, the team felt deflated after their crushing loss. So again, let's look at the context. If you were in this scenario, imagine, as some of you might do, you're football players, rugby players, cricket players, tennis players. Imagine if you trained for years and years and this was the pivotal match of your career, or even at school, you're in a school football team and this is the final school cup and you're down. Currently, it's 3-0 to the other team. Your coach comes in and tries to boost the morale, boost the mood of the room. But you're just sat there thinking, how can we pull this back? How can we really score 4 more goals in the time that we have left? You're going to be feeling deflated. It's this idea that you're left feeling more than just sad, more than just depressed. It's adding in an element of a lack of hope. You don't feel like it could possibly be done, rather. So to be deflated, I guess we look at this idea of crushing loss. If you were losing, you'd be feeling disappointed. or I would think that you'd be feeling disappointed despite somebody coming in and trying to boost the morale. And so we've got this idea of disappointment. And we can add that to this sadness. So basically, feeling deflated is a sort of sadness, but more so to do with a lack of hope. So you're feeling sad and without hope. Okay. Number 7 then. He was adamant that he had seen the dog run into the woods, refusing to change his mind. Again, let's look at the context of this scenario. Let's focus on this refusing to change his mind. You've all been, I bet, in this scenario where we've all been embarrassed to do it, but we've all thought that we were right. I know I have, and you're adamant that you are absolutely telling the truth, that you know this factual piece of information, but then somebody Googles it, and it turns out that you were horribly wrong. That is a good example of being adamant. It's when you're so not wanting to change that you think you're absolutely 100% right, even if it's embarrassing, even if it's crushing to you. You are unwilling to change, and that is what adamant is. It's this idea that you are unwilling to change your opinion. You are absolutely sure. So you are very certain and unwilling to change your mind. Okay. This next word I've picked because I think it will come in handy in our next session. In my exams and what I teach to my GCSE English students in tone and atmosphere, it's this word ominous comes up quite a lot. And it's a very useful one. It's probably one of the words when I've described the weather that I've used the most. So the ominous clouds gathered quickly, turning the sky dark before the storm hit. So let's start picking apart the words. It turned the sky dark. This idea of darkness. Most people, especially as young kids, find themselves almost innately scared of the dark. But why is this? Why do humans find themselves naturally scared of the dark? What is it about the dark that scares us so much? And I would argue it's the fear of the unknown. But why are we scared of the unknown? What do we really think is going to be down in that deep, dark cellar that's going to do us harm and hurt us? Because really, there's nothing, but we think there is. Our mind sometimes plays tricks on us. And so we can think of this ominous atmosphere as linking to that fear. The fear stemming from something that is going to do us harm, something that's going to hurt us. I know some of you might have come out of your Year 11 GCSE and you might yesterday have just written an essay about A Christmas Carol. One of the big famous quotes from that book is about Marley's ghost being described as a lobster or a bad lobster in a dark cellar. And it's the idea that his ghost is scary because we think of him as being this dangerous thing that could hurt us in the dark. And so when we think of something that is ominous, it is that exact same thing. It is something that is dark in personality, sinister, and could hurt us. It's something, think about a ghost film. Why are people scared of ghosts? Because we don't know what they do. They might hurt us. They're ominous because they could do us harm. Okay, so lastly then, the smell of freshly baked bread seemed to linger in the air long after the bakery had closed. So again, let's focus on this idea that it's long after the bakery had closed. It's this idea of bringing a time element into it. If we're lingering, it means that we're staying around, that we're not leaving when we should, or we're overstaying our welcome almost. So this idea that think about, you might have flowers in your house. Imagine the day that the flowers die and you take them away. What if you walk into your room and you can still smell the flowers? That's that smell lingering. It's the smell of the flowers remaining in the room, even though the flowers have gone. So this idea of lingering is to stay around or to stay put long after the time has passed. So if we're lingering, we're staying around. If I was to linger, I could linger. I could imagine the school bell is gone, the school day is over, and I stay to talk to the teacher. I could argue that I'm lingering, that I'm staying behind in the room. That's all this idea of lingering is, but it's with that added sort of negative connotation. If we linger, we don't tend to stay around for a necessarily positive reason. Doesn't have to be dark, but it does have to be, could be sad. It could be many reasons why we linger, but it tends to be because we're in our emotions and we feel a certain way. Okay, so they're sort of the 9 main words that we're going to focus on today. And we will do another exercise now where we come across 8 more words. But these are sort of the main 9 that I want you to think about as we go through our session. Okay. So we can do the same thing with paragraphs or longer sentences. Firstly, I'll change my color. Let's do this one in purple. So the boy was elated when he saw his exam results. He had worked hard and the top marks made him jump with joy. So this word, joy, is kind of what we're focusing on here. Joy is happiness. If you think about this example, he's got top marks. He's jumping for joy. We jump because we have energy. So this idea that we have is a high energy environment, that we are jumping for joy. Think about, you've opened your exam results. You've got, oh, blessed, you've got all 9s. You've put in the hard work. You're going to feel elated, basically meaning very happy or extremely happy, stemming from this idea that you've worked hard. So as the fire alarm rang, the students moved in a chaotic rush, tripping over bags and yelling to each other. So we kind of get what we need to from this sentence. Imagine there's a fire alarm, and this time it's not a drill. You've not been prepared for it. When I was at school, I used to dread the fire alarm because people would just be running back and forth. Nobody would really know where they were going. So this idea of chaos is this overwhelming atmosphere of something that's not very organized. I know at school you do fire alarms. You're supposed to line up in certain places so that they can do the register and account for your presence. But really, that's not going to happen. I mean, if a real fire alarm went off, you're going to be grabbing your things, you're going to be running out the door, you're going to be running down the stairs, you're going to be getting out to safety. So this idea of chaos is a disorganized mess, or high energy disorganized mess, rather. Okay, the timid kitten hid behind the couch every time somebody walked into the room. So let's pick apart this idea of hiding. If someone was to hide behind the couch, imagine, I know when I was young, I used to watch this show called Doctor Who when I was 6, 7 years old. And I remember the first time that this villain called the Weeping Angels came onto the screen, and I was terrified as a young kid. And you know, so many young kids do when you see horror films nowadays or something scary on the TV, you might hide. And why do we do that? Yes, it's this idea of fear again. So we hide behind the couch as a result of something scary. Now let's focus on this bit where it's someone walking into the room, because my example was TV, something that's not real, it's not based in reality. But imagine, let me give an example. Someone unfamiliar walks into the house when you're a child. Naturally, you might have nieces, nephews, brothers, sisters that age. Kids tend to be naturally scared of new people. And why is that? It's the fear of the unknown again. So this idea of being timid is to be shy or fearful. Okay. The soldiers were resilient, continuing to march even after days walking through rough terrain. So you might in school, I don't know if you still do this, you do sort of PSHCE back in, say, my days, if I'm old, but back in my day, we used to do this thing called enrichment, and we would teach these harder, tough skills. And one of them was resilience. So if someone is to be resilient in life, it's when they come across hardship. It's when you experience something that gets you so down and it's so tough that you don't know if you're ever going to come out of it. But then you do. Imagine if at school you've got a big test the next day, or you fell over at school and people laughed at you and you're embarrassed and you don't know how you're ever going to get over it. But then you sit and you think to yourself, you know what? No, I'm going to get up and I'm going to go back to school and I'm going to hold my head up high and I'm going to push through this hard situation. You would be described as resilient. You're someone who is pushing through the hardship. So you're continuing to fight. It's someone who continues to fight even through hardship or difficult times, let's put. You come out the other end a much better and determined person if you are resilient. So her generosity showed when she gave her prize money to charity instead of keeping it for herself. So someone who is generous then, she gave her prize money to charity. Obviously, a charity is a group of people or a company who fight for the greater good. For example, Cancer Research is a charity, and all the money that they get goes into finding cures for cancer, or maybe the Heart Foundation, the British Heart Foundation, fights for cures for heart disease. So if someone's giving their money to charity instead of keeping it for themselves, imagine this person could have gone to the shop, she could have bought yourself a nice outfit, but they didn't. They gave it to a charity to help fight disease. It's this idea of being almost selfless, the opposite of selfish, giving to other people rather than keeping for yourself. So giving rather than keeping. So we can describe generosity as somebody who is very willing to give. Do it purple. Let's do it green. So very willing to give. So for example, if I was generous, it might be your birthday, and I might give my best friend a really expensive gift because they've been asking for it and asking for it. And one day I've worked tirelessly at my job and I decide, you know what, we've been best friends for years and they deserve this gift. That's me being generous. I'm going above and beyond. I'm being very willing to go above and beyond and give my money and give my time to help my friend. I would be described as generous. Okay, the last three then, and then we can move on to the story portion. So the abandoned playground looked desolate, with rusting swings, overgrown weeds, and not a single child in sight. So let's think firstly of this not a single child in sight. If there's no one else around, we are alone. We might have been in this scenario before. You might have been walking home late at night, and the streets are empty because it's like 11 p.m., it's midnight, and there's no one around. This idea of being alone, the only person around. And let's build on that. This idea of the rusting swings, the overgrown weeds. Imagine this is your home and your garden, and you go into the garden and there's a bunch of overgrown weeds because you've not been bothered to do the gardening. You've not been bothered to get out the lawnmower and mow the lawn. It's because it's been neglected. We can say that you've ignored doing that job. So, firstly, desolate is to be alone, but it's also this idea of something almost empty. So the rusted swings, that's a swing that's never been used. I mean, if a swing is rusty, it means that that thing has never been used or not been used in years. I mean, if people are actively playing on the swings, they wouldn't be rusty. They'd be pure metal. So this idea of being desolate then is not only alone but being empty. So if we had a desolate landscape, it might be, for example, a desert. We know in the desert, no plants grow. It's only sand and rock. And you're walking in the desert, you might be firstly, the only person there, but secondly, it's an empty expanse. There's no plants, there's no water, there's only you and the sun and the sand. So it's empty, alone and empty. Okay, so the vibrant painting stood out on the wall, filled with bright reds, blues, and yellows. Imagine going to an art gallery and you see this beautiful painting on the wall, and what attracts you to it are all the bright colors. Similar to a rainbow, why people love rainbows is because they're filled with color. There's this idea that there's gold at the end, and it's this wonderful, exciting thing. So the idea of being vibrant is this full of life, but not only life, but color. Similar to this idea of the rainbow. Yes, there's many different colors that make up the rainbow, but there's this idea that it's created through the mixture of water and the sun and all this energy coming together. We can describe it as vibrant. So, final one then. After skipping breakfast and lunch, Mia was ravenous by dinner and ate everything on her plate in minutes. So if she's eating everything on her plate, that tells us that she was potentially hungry or very hungry. So this one's a nicer or more simple one. This idea of being ravenous is to be very hungry. Okay. Yeah, so if you have any questions as we go along, the chat is open and I'm here to answer any questions. But as far as the learning new words, I hope we can take some of these away. I encourage you to practice them at home, start trying to use them in conversations, write stories using them, use them with your friends and your families. But we're going to look at a story now that uses most of these words, and we're going to look at how we can start to understand what's happening to characters in the story. So it's one that I've gone and written, so don't judge me. I never claimed to be a writer, but I've tried as best I can, and I've highlighted these keywords, and we're going to begin to answer questions about this text. Okay, so as I go through, start to imagine what's happening in your head. So the letter, I've called it. Daniel lingered by the railings, watching students spill through the school gates like marbles loosened from a jar. Laughter came in short bursts, sudden and chaotic, bouncing between the buildings. The envelope in his pocket bent slightly as he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He didn't fix it. Across the yard, Mia laughed, that easy, generous laugh that made people lean in. She was balancing a plastic tray and someone else's coat, tiptoeing, dodging puddles without looking down. One of the year sevens ran past her, slipped, and she caught their elbow before they hit the ground. They never looked back to thank her. Daniel turned away. The clouds had been rolling in all morning, low, slow, the kind that didn't announce themselves with thunder but settled in, ominous and sure of their place. A breeze flicked the corner of his shirt. He didn't move to tuck it back in. Are you waiting for somebody? Miss Ellis didn't pause for an answer, already halfway up the stairs with her lunch in hand. Daniel didn't reply. His fingers brushed the edge of the envelope again, then pulled away. He hadn't eaten. He couldn't. The canteen had smelled like toast and pizza and the kind of chips that left your fingers greasy for hours. He'd queued, tray in hand, then left it on the counter untouched. He was ravenous, yet he didn't feel hungry. The letter had taken an hour. Not the writing was quick. It was the folding, the refolding, the way he'd started over after one corner didn't line up. His mum had said he was being meticulous, but she'd said it with a smile, so maybe it wasn't the insult it felt like. He spotted her again, Mia, this time alone, twirling the strap of her bag as she walked. There was a timid sort of calm in the way that she moved, like someone waiting for a question they didn't want to answer. Daniel took 2 steps forward, stopped, and turned back. The letter felt heavier now. By the time he finally crossed the yard, she was already gone. He sank down onto the bench beside the bike shed, staring at the rusted handlebars. The hum of the school faded into the background. It was serene there, in a way. quiet, still. And yet, in his chest, he felt deflated, like a balloon tied too tightly left out in the cold. Then footsteps. He looked up. It was Mia. I think this is yours, she said, reluctantly holding the envelope. Someone left it under my bag. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. She waited, then read his name on the front again, her brow creasing, a little bewildered, but not unkind. Daniel nodded, somehow adamant now, and gestured for her to keep it. She did. And when she smiled, really smiled, not the kind she gave to teachers or Year Sevens passing jokes, it was him that she looked at. And he felt, for a moment, elated. Okay. So I hope you had a bit of a think about what's actually happening here, because on the surface, it is a story about, obviously, a school kid who's clearly got a crush on this girl, and he doesn't know how to talk to her, and he tries to give her a letter, and he misses her, and she responds quite positively in the end. But really, the word choices are there to give a bit of a deeper layer as to what's happening. And so we'll kind of start to think about how those word choices begin to unlayer certain aspects of the story. So, first question, how does Daniel feel about giving Mia the letter? Well, I think it's pretty obvious that he's kind of nervous, but how do we know this? We know this because at the start of the story, we get words such as, hang on a minute, I have to replace my pen. Okay. We get words such as lingered. So we came across this word early on in our set of words. And to linger was to stay about, was to stay put. So the idea that he lingered tells us something about him as a character and how he's maybe feeling on the inside. So yes, he's nervous, but when somebody lingers, it's because they're waiting for something to happen. He's nervously waiting. And the context of the story, he's waiting to give her that letter and he's trying to find the right time. But as we can tell later in the story, obviously, that she's busy. She's with her friends. She's got this very positive kindness about her. And I think that's what makes him nervous. So the idea that he's lingered and nervously waiting as he tries to find not only the right moment to give her the letter, the right moment, but also the confidence in himself to be able to go over and give her that letter. So the right moment and confidence to give Mia the letter. Is this idea, if someone is lingering, he's potentially maybe overthinking as well. I don't know if you've ever been in a scenario where you've been so scared, maybe in class, to you know the answer, but you don't want to put your hand up because you're scared of maybe getting it wrong. And so you sort of sit there and we can say that maybe you linger. You kind of like half put your hand up and it sort of lingers there. It stays there for a little bit because you're in your head, you're overthinking, what if I get this wrong? I don't want to embarrass myself. And so you're sort of nervously kind of contemplating, do I answer the question? And that's the idea of lingering. It's this overthinking in a nervous way. So on the surface, lingering, yes, he's nervous, he's staying about, but why is he doing that? Because he's overthinking and he's waiting for the confidence to come over him. So we can say he lacks confidence, is what it tells us about him. The situation means a lot to him. Okay. So, how do the clouds relate to the character in the story? So, if you remember back to my keyword, I used the word ominous, and I said this would come up a lot in terms of the weather, in terms of tone. To be ominous is something that is potentially scary and could do you harm. So if the clouds are described as ominous, yes, on a very literal level, these clouds are scary, they are dark, they are potentially sinister, maybe indicating a storm. But on a more perceptive level, on a more deep level, could we potentially argue? We're going to be doing language or literature. Language, it will be from 8 till 9. Specifically, we're looking at language rather than structure. So basically, could we argue then that this storm could in some way mimic or reflect the internal emotions of our character Daniel? We could say that the clouds mirror how Daniel feels, which in this instance, as we just discussed, is nervous. And why is he nervous? Because of the unknown. He's nervous and scared. And so sometimes we use the weather in writing to tell you something about the character. Okay, it's question 3 then. Why does Daniel feel ravenous even though he hasn't eaten all day? What might this tell us about his state of mind? So, yes, on a literal sense, ravenous means very hungry. And this kind of ties into what we're going to do in the 8 to 9 session. But sometimes, and this is kind of what I was talking about, the nuance of the English language, sometimes things can be used in a way that they don't exactly mean on a literal level. So the idea that somebody is ravenous is, yes, he's very hungry. He's very hungry. However, he's not literally hungry. So if someone is not literally hungry, we could use this maybe literally in a metaphorical sense. And we'll kind of discuss this a bit further in our 8 to 9 session. But sometimes language can be used not literally, so in a metaphorical sense. So if he's not feeling literally hungry, it tells us that maybe he's craving something that isn't food. And in the context of our story, he's very scared to take the letter. He wants clearly Mia's attention. He fancies her and he wants the love from her. So he's craving something that isn't food. And in this context, it is Mia's affection. So I hope this serves as a good example as to how language can be used not in the literal, but can still tell us something deep about a character. Okay, moving on so we can finish these questions. What is the significance of Daniel folding the letter, and how does this relate to his personality or situation? So kind of similar to the ravenous scenario that we just covered. If we look back in the story, it describes him as folding the letter meticulously, or rather, it being meticulous. And we kind of talked about this idea of him being meticulous, this idea that it's done with careful precision. So yes, on a literal level, he does it carefully and with detail and precision. But if we look on a deeper level and explore why does he do this? Well, he clearly cares for this girl's affection. He clearly fancies this girl. In the sense that also he was lingering, and he was lingering because he was in his head, similar to the I'm scared to put my hand up situation in class. You do something because you're nervous. And sometimes when we're incredibly nervous about something, we tend to come up with these sort of actions that are calming for us. They're coping mechanisms. And you might have one in life. So, for example, sometimes people take themselves away to sort of meditate, or sometimes you might be in class and you're incredibly bored or you're scared, and you get a fidget thing and you start fidgeting with your pen or chewing your pen, or I don't know, like sometimes I was in class and I used to stab the rubber with a pencil. That's a coping mechanism. It's a way of trying to cover those negative emotions with something that's quite soothing to you personally, anyway. So, yes, he's folding it carefully and with precision, but why is he doing that? He cares very much for Mia. It matters to him very greatly that this goes well. So, it matters that this goes well. So, if we're thinking about this idea that he is clearly very nervous, maybe this is a coping mechanism for him. Sometimes in life, we can't always control everything. And this is a lesson that is sometimes learned the hard way. We can't always control everything in life. You know, sometimes you might want somebody to like you who doesn't like you. That's out of your control. You can't control how other people feel. So sometimes that makes us scared and nervous. And so this is his way of trying to deal with that unknown. So it's a coping mechanism. He can't control how Mia feels. But what he can control is this paper. Hence, coping mechanism. So, but he can control the paper. It is comforting to him. It is but a comfort. Okay, question number 5 then. This decides to zoom out. What do we learn about Mia earlier in the story? Well, let's go back up. We learn that she has a very generous laugh. It makes people lean in. She's balancing a plastic tray in someone else's coat. She's tiptoeing, dodging puddles without looking down. So let's focus on this idea then, firstly, of her being generous. When we said someone is generous, it's because they're giving. They're willing to give. So that tells us that she is perhaps selfless. She cares about other people. So do you see sort of what I'm doing here? I'm not just saying the literal. I'm kind of thinking beyond and trying to think, what can we actually tell about person from these words? So yes, she's willing to give, but that means she cares. People only give because they care. Potentially could give because it's ulterior motive, but let's think positively for now. Okay, so she was balancing a plastic tray in someone else's coat. I mean, somebody else's coat. Clearly, she cares. Clearly, she is a very popular person. She's popular. She's selfless. Again, she's kind. She's tiptoeing. When people tiptoe, it can be quite a positive thing. It's kind of a rhythmic thing. It tells us that she's a happy person. Dodging puzzles, again, playful. So what we can tell from Mia from these words is that she's got a very kind and selfless personality, perhaps very playful and happy. Okay. Why does Daniel feel deflated? Because he does feel deflated. It tells us that's one of our key words. It tells us that he sat on the bench and his chest felt deflated like a balloon. But why does he feel deflated? Well, it tells us earlier on. It says that the letter felt heavier now. Again, this is our idea of a metaphor. The letter can't suddenly gain weight. It can't suddenly get heavier, but it has on an emotional level. You know, I've not gone in, I've not put rocks in his pocket. It's not literally heavier. It's on an emotional level. So the letter feels heavier because, again, he cares very much about the situation and he needs it to go well. And so he feels heavier on a metaphorical sense. So it's a metaphorical thing and it represents or symbolizes his emotions. Much like the ominous clouds, sometimes we can have objects that represent or tell us something about our character by mirroring it. So it mirrors Daniel's emotions. And I want to drill this in quite early on in our sort of like because this is dedicated to sort of year 7 to 8 level English, and I kind of want to drill it in early that often in English we use words to represent something else. So, for example, the clouds representing Daniel's frustrations and fear, and now the heavier letter mirroring and representing Daniel's emotions, that he now feels heavy. He feels heavy emotionally. So I want to drill that in, that this is quite a common occurrence in English. And this is how you get to those higher levels later down the line when you actually do your GCSEs, is you start thinking about these things beyond the literal, about the metaphorical. Okay, so sorry, we didn't answer this question. He feels deflated because she was already gone. He missed the opportunity. He missed out on giving her the letter. And clearly, as we know from everything else, the fact that he's lingering, that he's folding the paper, this meant a lot to him. So now that he's missed the opportunity, he's going to feel sad and without hope. Because he was hopeful for most of this. He was hungry, he was ravenous, he cared a lot for this to go well. But now he's without hope, similar to the scenario of a sports game. If we compare this is Daniel in the final quarter of a game, and he's losing at this point, and so he's without hope. However, I kind of hand in hand, question 7, how does the description of the schoolyard contrast Daniel's feelings? How does this enhance what we know about Daniel? So the description of the schoolyard, is we've got this idea of the hum of the school faded into the background. It was serene there, quiet, still. I would argue that these words kind of feel peaceful. I mean, I don't know if you've ever taken yourself away and you've sat, say you've gone to the park, for example, and you've sat and you've listened to the birds and the running water. It's a very peaceful environment. Sometimes when we feel sad and we feel angry, it's better to take ourselves away and to just think about that and think about the scenario and the situation and put ourselves at ease, I guess, trying to comfort ourselves. So it's a peaceful environment. Why has he gone there? He's taken himself away out of comfort. He has gone to comfort himself. So it contrasts, it's opposite, because he feels inside very sad, very deflated. However, the environment is very peaceful and calm. Whereas I don't think he's very calm. I think he's sad. I think he's deflated. So it's the contrast between calm to Daniel's sadness. Okay. Question 8. What does Mia's response to the letter suggest about her feelings or character? I personally think she responded quite well in this scenario. It says, "I think this is yours," she said, reluctantly holding the envelope. But then it also says, she waited, her brows creasing, a little bewildered, but not unkind. So let's break these words apart like we did. Reluctance is where you don't want to do something. So she's unwilling. Or not wanting to, rather than unwilling, I suppose, is the wrong way to describe it. It's someone not wanting to. So she's not wanting to hold the envelope. But there's many reasons why that might be. It's not necessarily because she's in disgust or that she doesn't fancy him back or that she's annoyed at him or anything like that. It could just be that she's nervous too. So this idea of reluctance can go, or we can be interpreted multiple ways. And this kind of links to what you're asked to do at the GCSE exam, because in question 4, you'll be asked to interpret. So this idea that it's reluctance could be highlight interpretation here. interpretation. It's this idea that it could be either that she's angry or something negative, or that it could just be that she's nervous as well. And actually, it's something loving and positive. But it can be interpreted either way. Obviously, a lot of English is based on your own experiences in life. A lot of how we interpret certain words is based on our experiences in life and our emotions. And so I guess how you read this is dependent on, well, I guess, how you interpret life. So are you the kind of person who thought that she was angry, or are you the kind of person that thought she was actually coming from a loving place? That can be debated. Okay, let's quickly get through these last two, and then we'll move on to some actual GCSE level English. So, what does Adam's response to Mia tell us about him? Well, he's adamant. And adamant, or being adamant, is when you're unwilling to change, or you're confident in what you're saying. So, unwilling to change or confidence. And does that confidence not tell us how he has changed as a character? Considering at the beginning he was lingering, he was folding the letter, he was nervous, he took himself away to sit on the bench. But now he's confident, he's gained confidence, so he has changed as a character. There has been some sort of internal change, I should write, or emotional change. So it tells us that he has developed as a character. I guess also, I should probably say, it's a positive thing, because for a moment he felt elated, therefore very happy, which supports what we've been saying this entire time, that he clearly cares a lot about this character, Mia. And it means a lot to him. And so when it pays off, similar to how your exams pay off, you feel very happy. Yes, this is around year 8 level of work. So no actual naming of terminology yet. At year 8, we kind of expect you to be able to start to learn new vocabulary and start to basically pick apart how we interpret stories. What can we actually take away from them? So final question then, how does the reader feel at the end of the story? And this kind of is a lovely link to what we're going to do in the next hour if you stay or if people join, looking about the effects of the reader. In a very general year 8 level sense. It's based on obviously your experience. As I was saying before, English is very much what you take away with it, or what you take away from a story is based on your own experiences in life. You know, we all go through our unique experiences. So how I might interpret a story might be very different to how you interpret a story. There's no right or wrong answer in English. And to kind of circle back to what I said at the beginning, this is kind of what scares people away from the English subject, is that there's so many nuances of it, that there are no rights or wrongs. And it's all about arguing. It's not like science where there's a correct answer, or maths where it's either right or wrong, you say you're working out. English is very much what you feel and what you could argue to be the truth. So how does the reader feel at the end of the story? I would argue I came away feeling quite hopeful. Whether that's what you take away is up to you. Whether you could argue that to me if I was to pick on you and say, what did you take away? If you could argue and your point to me, it's correct. But I would personally take away that this is quite a hopeful story. I've come away from it feeling quite happy, quite complete in my life. Okay, so I know this was a very general introduction to English at year 7 and 8 level. I hope you've been able to take some new words away from this. Again, go away. I encourage you to practice them. I encourage you to use them with your family and your friends so that when you get to actual GCSE level, you'll be able to use them in your creative writing, because we get marked on using new vocabulary at GCSE. So these are lovely higher level words to begin to put into your writing. And I hope you've taken something away from this. So what we're going to do is, whilst I set up for the next session, if any of you have any questions, put them in the chat. I'm happy to answer them while we wait a couple of minutes to start the next one while the people join. But yeah, I hope you've taken something away from this. And as I say, this is kind of the beginning of our series of English. And I thought, or I hoped this was a lovely place to begin on how to pick out things from a story. So yeah, take a minute or two while I set up. Questions in the chat, please, if you have any. But otherwise, thank you for coming. So yes, this is going to happen every Tuesday now, and it will most likely be me every Tuesday. So I hope I'm helping you because yeah, we thought basically that step to success, don't teach enough English, considering that it is one of the two major subjects at your school. So um, since nobody else likes teaching English, and I personally love teaching English, I am putting together a series of things to teach. So please, reach out if there's something that you really struggle with or you want help with, please tell me because I'm starting to put together a syllabus basically that we can do every Tuesday. So yeah, I'm in need of pointers. So if you have anything specific, please let me know because I'll be incredibly grateful. I'm going to be useful rather, and I'll be grateful for it. But yeah, it's every Tuesday from 7 till 8 for your sort of like year 7, year 8 level, and then then 8 till 9 of the specific GCSE content. Okay, so it's hit 8. I'm guessing that everyone who's still here is here for the next part. And we're not going to get too much harder today because, as I said, I've been trying to put together a clear syllabus. And I thought the best place to start, or rather, actually, before we start, for those of you doing GCSE, and this is applicable to every single exam board, but here we kind of teach AQA mostly because that's what most people do. But this is applicable to every exam board. In your exam, you will be taught or asked to provide answers between language and structure. So my key question to you is, what is the difference between language and structure? Because this is a common mistake. And you don't want to be making this mistake because separate questions ask for these separate things. So you don't want to be writing about the wrong thing. Firstly, let's begin with language. Language is to do with the specific word choices. So specific word choices. What has the writer chosen to put into their work to add to the story, to add to their writing, to tell you something specific? So language is specific word choices. And there are multiple language techniques. There are 22, in fact, and I've broken them apart. So this week we're only going to focus on a few, and then we'll begin to build over the next few weeks. Because there's no point me trying to go over everything at once. It just is not helpful to you. So if you think today that I'm not being detailed enough, or you think that you want to go into more difficult or higher level techniques, come back because I'm going from the basis today. So language is a specific word choices. So that is, for example, and this is not limited to stuff like similes, metaphors, personification, symbolism, all of that sort of stuff. Also including your specific word choices, so your adjectives, your verbs, your nouns, your adverbs, that sort of thing. Whereas structure, actually I'll do this in a different color. Structure is how something is written. So it's the way that something is written. The way something is written. So this could include things like the pacing. So how does the pacing change what we read? How does The specific length of the paragraphs change what we read. How does the story progress from beginning to end? Are new characters introduced? Does the setting change? Does the time change? Is there different sentence types used? That sort of thing. But for the next few weeks, we are going to focus primarily on language, because if you are doing AQA, paper 1, question 2 is very specific to language, whereas question 3 is specific to structure. Question 4 is both language and structure. However, in paper 2, structure is never asked about specifically, whereas language comes up as a second 12 marker. So language is a bit more important than structure, and I think easier to pick out. Okay. So let me pull over. When it comes to your specific GCSE, the way that I like to teach paragraphs, and I think this is a good way of writing a paragraph, I teach it a Peter paragraph. So this is point, evidence, technique, explain, and reader. And each of these things kind of affects the other. So the point comes from everything else. Your evidence, there's a technique in the evidence. The explanation comes from the use of the technique, and the effect on the reader comes from the explanation. So what we're going to focus on, and I decided that the best way to do this is to go backwards. So we're going to focus on specifically the effects on the reader today and how, because I do a lot of English marking. If you didn't know, when you do English homework, most of it comes to me. So if you get it, or it has done recently. And what I've been noticing recently in people's answers is that, that very few people are writing about how writing affects the reader. But if you look at the specific mark schemes for the questions, you get marked specifically on saying how things affect the reader. So if you don't put it, you're losing marks. You're doing yourself an injustice. So today we're going to look at relating to language techniques, how things affect the reader. And this is where I kind of said that things might seem a bit simple to you guys, but I think it's very important stuff. And if you've been with me for the last few months, we kind of did a similar lesson to this a few months ago, where we looked at tone and atmosphere. So language analysis questions require you to make what we call a perceptive inference. So what this is it's not just stating the literal. For example, if we go back to in our last session, we covered the ominous clouds. Yes, on a literal level, it's a dark day. Great. But we need to start looking beyond that. We need to start saying, okay, but what does that actually mean in the context of our story? So perceptive inference is something that is beyond the literal intentions of the writer. And to make perceptive inferences from a story, we need to pay close attention to the connotations of specific word choices. So a connotation, if none of you have come across this word before, don't fret. It's a fancy word for something really simple. A connotation is something that you take away from a word. So going back to this, in the previous session, we looked at interpreting the word reluctance, or to do something reluctantly. One connotation of that word could be that she was scared, or the other connotation or interpretation of that word could be that she was angry. The connotation is what we get as a reader when we read that word. Hence what I was saying in the last session about how English is all about your experiences in life. So it is the emotions, ideas, or associations a word suggests beyond its literal meaning. Authors often choose words carefully to subtly reveal a character's mood, motivation, or relationships without stating them outright. So this is what I mean. You could, on a literal level, yeah, it was a dark day, but what does that mean? You know, what's that character feeling? Do the clouds mimic that feeling? Does the clouds tell us something about what's going to happen in the story? Is it foreboding? Does it foreshadow later on? Is it pathetic fallacy? Does it tell us that our character is struggling on the inside? Does it mean that the storm is violent? All of these things are connotations, things that we take away from the word choices. So, for example, describing a setting as desolate rather than simply empty suggests not only physical emptiness, which would be our literal interpretation. Let me highlight this as our literal, but emotional loneliness or hopelessness. This is what I'm saying. That is our perceptive inference. It's going above and beyond and looking at something else. So that is our perceptive inference. By analyzing these nuanced choices, readers can infer deeper meanings about the characters and themes that aren't explicitly stated. So, coming back to my point, evidence, explain, then point is what is the writer showing us? Evidence is where in the text do we see it? A technique is how is the writer showing us? Is it a simile? Is it a metaphor? Is it personification? Is it alliteration? The explanation is why is the technique used? What connotations does it evoke? How does it make us feel? What can we see? The reader is then, how does it affect the reader? How does it make us feel? What does it make us think? What can we learn about the characters? So, focusing then on the effect of the reader, there are two language analysis techniques that are key terminology. So you will get marks if you say this in an exam that affect how a reader interprets language. So one is tone and one is atmosphere. But what is the difference? Tone and atmosphere influence how the reader is affected. They are created by the reader's ability to infer something from the connotations of certain words. It's the use of other language techniques that provide these connotations. So this is what I'm saying about working backwards. Yes, there might be personification, but it's that personification that creates the tone or the atmosphere. And therefore, is that atmosphere or the tone that makes me feel in a certain way. So it all builds. So my tip to you is in an exam, if you were to write the effect of the reader, include those words in your explanation, because tone and atmosphere come into pretty much everything or every exam question. Sorry, how the reader more important or linking to context? So how does it affect the reader? Is that more important than linking to context? So if this is language, yes. If we're thinking specifically about English language GCSE, how we affect the reader is kind of our primary focus. There's not really context comes into language. If you're thinking about literature, both, because they're marked separately. So in terms of literature, it'll be 30 marks and there'll be 14 marks off the top of my head for language analysis. And that comes under how do we affect the reader? Whereas there's 6 external marks also for context. So they are different things. So yes, they're both equally important in terms of literature. However, affecting the reader is more important in language. I will go over what tone and atmosphere is. So tone and atmosphere are at the basis of how the writing makes us feel and determine what we take away from the story and what we think about the characters. So if you're thinking about specifically defining these things, then tone refers to the author's attitude towards a subject. It's conveyed through the choice of words, sentence structure, and style. It reflects how the writer feels about the material they're presenting. So, for example, a tone could be formal, informal, sarcastic, serious, sympathetic, etc. A good example of this, we'll go over how to use them. A good example of this, of tone, is I could say to you, on one hand, I could come to you and I could say to you, oh my God, you are doing really well. Or, example number 2, I could come to you and I could say, yeah, you're doing really well. The tone, I said the same thing, but the tone is very different. Tone is the way that something is presented. That is how it determines how we feel. In that example, in the happy example, I come to you and I've said, all right, you're doing really well. That tone is very positive. It's very happy. It's very hopeful. And obviously you're going to come away feeling like, wow, I'm doing great. That's amazing. I've had the best day ever. Like I've just been complimented. That's amazing. If I came to you and said the opposite, and I said it in a very negative way, and I said, you're doing amazing, you're doing great. Yeah, okay, what I've said is positive, but the way that I've said it is clearly not very positive. You're going to come away feeling very like, oh, well, it's a very positive thing that he said, but like it's making me feel quite bad about myself. Maybe it was sarcastic. So this is the difference in tone. Tone is the way that things are presented. So it could be happy or it could be sarcastic and negative. That is tone. Does that make sense? So in terms of writing then, um, the specific word choices and the way that you read it is the tone, or determines how you therefore feel about it. So atmosphere and the difference to tone is the atmosphere is the mood. So in that example, the tone is the way that I've said it, and the sarcastic, I said it in a not very nice way. Whereas the atmosphere is the emotion. So the atmosphere would be you coming away and being like, oh, that was a very negative atmosphere. It's made me feel very bad about myself. Whereas the tone is very sarcastic. But the atmosphere is negative, it's jarring, it's does that make sense? The difference between tone and atmosphere then? So tone is the way that it's presented, and atmosphere is the emotion that it brings up. And we're going to look at how to interpret these or how to incorporate these into your answers because, as I say, my tip for you is every time you're writing about how things affect the reader, I would include those words or at least one of them. So, for example, I could say the clouds are personified as a sinister force, therefore creating a ominous tone, which makes the reader feel scared or threatened. It's the tone that makes me feel threatened. You know what I mean? Yes, personification has been used, but the explanation is that it's created a negative tone. And if I was to interpret that as a reader, I'd feel very unsettled by that. Whereas I could say, it's been very hot today. It's been very sunny and it's been like very calming. I can hear the wind of the trees. I can hear the birds chirping. That tone is much more positive, and therefore I'm going to come away feeling calm and relaxed and happy and joyful. And that's the difference between tone and atmosphere. So, as a general sort of look at them, for a sort of dark and eerie atmosphere, these are four very generalized points, but you're looking at words such as like howling, shadows, cold, abandoned, lonely, eerie, trembling, haunted, dark, ominous, distant. All of those word choices, the specific word choices, command how you feel as a reader because we feel a certain way about those words. So, for example, kind of what I was going back to what I was saying about how English is a personal experience, it's about your experiences. Howling, or actually, let's focus on shadows. Shadows creates a dark atmosphere, this unsettling feeling. In the last session, we talked about the dark. Why is the dark scary? Because it is the unknown. So, from my personal experiences, imagine if I'm walking down a dark alleyway and there's a mysterious figure following me in the shadows. I'm obviously going to have associations to that in a very negative way. I'm going to associate that with a negative thing, something that's quite scary. So that's where the atmosphere comes from. Those specific word choices are linked to my own experiences. So the shadows to me is something scary and therefore creates a eerie or scary atmosphere. Similar to this idea of trembling in context. When do people tremble? It's because they're scared. Their muscles shake. So I associate this with fear. That is the atmosphere. Okay, so for sort of bright and joyful atmosphere, I'd be looking at words like sunshine, laughter, warmth, golden, bright, vibrant. All these words that have connotations of something happy or calming. For a sort of calm and peaceful atmosphere, words like gentle, quiet, soothing, serene, still, calm, restful, peaceful, all those words that have connotations of, again, sort of like serenity, peace. For a tense and suspenseful atmosphere, imagine if I'm reading a mystery novel and my character is being chased by a mysterious force. That would be suspense. I'd be on the edge of my seat with tension. So words like rattling, tight, rapid, uncertain, narrow, anxious, pounding, quick, stifling. Let's focus on these words, pounding and stifling. Pounding mimics the sort of the heart pumping. And when does the heart pump fastest? When we're either exercising or fearful. So the heart pumping is something fearful. So imagine if in my example, I'm running away from someone following me, my heart's going to be pumping, it's going to be pounding as it rushes blood to my veins, to my muscles, so that I can get away quickly. It's something stifling. It is uncomfortable. It's like I'm trapped. And so obviously that is an uncomfortable feeling linked to tension and suspense. Okay. So I won't go over all of these, but have a basic look at these, some kind of tones that could come up. Obviously, you don't need to memorize all of these. These should be based on how you feel. But I'll give you just 30 seconds, have a bit of a look over these, make yourself familiar with sort of examples of tones that you could write about. Stuff like feeling optimistic or affectionate, compared to something that's angry or bitter. I'll give you another example. Imagine if I said to you in an optimistic way, like, imagine, let's go back to our sports analogy, and I'm in the middle of a game and it's halftime and we're down 2-0. I could say to you in an optimistic tone, I think we're going to win this. Or I could come to you and say in a very bitter tone, I could say to you, I think we're going to win this. Two very different tones, but the same thing has been said. So you can have very different tones, irritated, cynical, ominous, conflicted, suspenseful. Again, I want to stress you have to memorize all these. These are just some examples of things that you could write about based on emotion. Same with atmospheres, suspenseful, it could be foreboding. So foreboding, does it foreshadow something negative later down the line? Foreshadow negativity. Is it chaotic, like in our last session? Is there lots of energy? Is it something that's there's disorder about? Is it something that's hostile? Something that's aggressive and violent? A menacing atmosphere. All of these things are designed to make the reader feel a certain way. So yes. Okay, we need to move on because I've got a few things planned. Let me have a look at the question. Check my speech. Yes, please do send it to me. I want to stress this now. I'm basically the designated English person at Step to Success. So if you want to send me anything, whether it's writing an answer that you've written, or speech that you've written, send it to me, please. I implore you to send it to me, and I'm happy to mark anything that you need me to mark. I'm here to help. So yes, please do send it to me. I'd be happy. Okay. So matching the tone and the atmosphere, just so we kind of get a sense of how we're starting to create tone and atmosphere then. So these are our 10 that we're going to start to match, and they're common 10 ones that you might want to use. Stay around at the end. I will, I'm sure, or even email Mr. Siddiqui, and he will give you my email if you need it to send me anything that you need to do. Okay, so in the distance, the first rays of sunlight pierced through the clouds, touching the ground with a soft glow that promised a new beginning. There are specific word choices in here that kind of indicate what kind of tone and atmosphere this is going to be. So, for example, sunlight pierced through the clouds. The connotation here is what it makes us think about. Personally, I think that's quite a positive image. So we need to think beyond the literal. Yes, on a literal sense, the weather, the sun is going through the clouds. Yes, that is technically correct, but that's a literal interpretation. On a metaphorical or perceptive interpretation, it's what does that actually mean in relation to a character or emotions. I would say it's quite a hopeful thing, personally. On a metaphorical sense, imagine, similar to our last story, the clouds are representing the internal conflict, something negative, whereas the sunlight is symbolizing hope and something like a light at the end of the tunnel. So I would argue this is a hopeful tone or atmosphere that's created through this that makes me feel as a reader very hopeful and calm and safe. So it makes me feel safe because it is a hopeful tone atmosphere. Again, we've got words like a new beginning. Sometimes when people want to start over, it's because they've either been embarrassed or they've done something bad and they just want a new start. And a new start is fresh. It's hopeful. This whole idea is it's hopeful. So the moonlight flickered on the old map, casting shadows over the unknown paths that seemed to shift with every glance, as if they were hiding something just out of reach. The specific word choices here change our tone and atmosphere. So in the opposite to the first one, we have moonlight rather than sunlight. Our connotations, our associations with the word moonlight might be something very different to the sun. Moonlight is associated with the night. And we associate with the night with secrecy. In the day, all our truths are out in the open, whereas at night, it's something that's very secret, something that's undercover, it's darkness. Mysterious things happen in the nighttime. This idea of flickering. Think about a light going on and off in your house. Imagine if you walked into the kitchen in the middle of the night and the light started flickering. The connotations of that, or the way that it makes you feel, is you'd be quite scared because you'd be thinking like, oh, it feels a bit supernatural. It feels a bit, this isn't right. It's not normal. It's not ordinary. So that tells us, again, or implicates the tone of what's going on here. Same, shadows, the darkness, the fear of the unknown, paths that shifted with every glance, as if they were hiding something out of reach. So I would argue here that this is a tone of something that is potentially mysterious. Mysterious here, because it's something out of the ordinary. And I've worked that out based on my personal experiences in relation to those words. So the moonlight is something that's hidden. We want to learn something about the mystery of it. The flickering, what's causing that flickering? What's hiding in the shadows? All of these questions are evoked, therefore a mysterious tone. Questions. Okay, so the clock ticked louder with each passing second, the heavy silence in the room broken only by the distant sound of footsteps that seemed to be getting closer, yet no one was in sight. So again, we've got this fear factor that no one was in sight. We've got the clock ticking, the heavy silence. Again, we'll kind of come on to this in later weeks, but that's an oxymoron. The heavy silence. It's two contrasting things that can't be. This idea of the clock ticking, that onomatopoeia of the ticking, how does that affect our tone in our atmosphere? The footsteps that got closer, but no one was in sight. This juxtaposition as well. All of these things begin to affect our tone and atmosphere. So I would argue this is one of suspense. And I will cross them out as I go through. Okay, so the empty swing swayed slowly in the breeze. Its soft, rhythmic motion, the only sign that something once lived there, now lost in the silence of absence. So again, we've got keywords here that tell us something about, or that have connotations. So this empty swing, the absence, the something once lived. Let me not cover up the technique. The once lived, all of these kind of have connotations of something that's gone. Something gets lost, so gone / lost. So which of these words links to something that's gone or that's lost? I'd argue either grief or nostalgia, but here I would argue grief. Because when we grieve, I don't know if any of you have ever lost anyone in life. But when somebody's gone or they've died, we end up grieving them as we celebrate their life or what was their life. And so the tone of this is grief because it's the idea of loss. Again, if we were in later weeks, we're going to start exploring further language techniques, but we've got the swing swayed slowly, this alliteration or this sibilant alliteration, again, creates this idea or emphasizes our idea of loss. So the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it a faint, unsettling whisper that seemed to come from deep within the darkened forest, urging anyone who heard it to turn back. So this, again, is something that's quite scary, I would argue. The wind howling, we've got the sort of like animalistic imagery of the wind, unsettling whisper, this imagery, the personification of the wind, the darkened forest, all of these things we can associate or have connotations of something that's scary. So I would argue that this one is ominous. It is something that makes us as a reader feel scared. So it has an ominous tone. So the soft murmur of the river's flow blended with the rustling of the leaves, creating a gentle harmony that settled over the quiet meadow like a warm embrace. So again, I keep emphasizing this, but come back for my later series and we'll be adding more language techniques. But we've got a lovely simile here, as well as onomatopoeia, the imagery. We've got the rustling of the leaves. We've got the warm embrace, the soft murmur, all of this sort of personification, the onomatopoeia, the imagery of it, I would argue make me feel quite calm. And so it would be a calming tone because I associate these words with something peaceful. Okay, change again, go to red. The garden, once vibrant with colour, now stood silent and empty, its withered flowers whispering of a time when laughter filled the air. So we've kind of, again, got this idea of it was once vibrant. We've lost something. It stood silent and empty. Its withered flowers whispering of a time when laughter filled the air. Again, I think I may have repeated one, embarrassing for me, but I think I may have repeated one. Similar to the one above in green, we've got this idea of grief and loss again. Although we could argue that this is sadness also. Because I guess sadness comes with grief. But the garden was once vibrant in colour. The colour has been drained. We've lost life. So this is where we get another technique. We get the symbolism, something representing something else. And we'll come on to that in about 5 minutes. But when something loses colour, that is symbolic of draining out of life. Again, there's withered flowers. Again, this idea of death. The whispering all gives us this idea of grief and sadness. Okay. The worn leather chair, tucked by the window, still held the faint scent of old books and coffee, reminding her of long afternoons spent in silence, lost in thought. So, the tone here is very different. We've got this idea of held the faint scent of old books. I don't know if you would agree. I personally love the smell of old books. So I think this is quite a positive imagery or set of imagery. So I don't think it's necessarily something negative, but it reminds her, this idea of reminding her, we're thinking back to another time of afternoons spent in silence, lost in thought. So I would argue that this one is potentially nostalgic, because nostalgia is when somebody looks back into the past in fondness, with happiness. So the idea that the smell still lingers, our word from the first session, it hangs around and it reminds her of a happy time and she thinks back to it in positivity. I don't know if at night you've ever laid in bed and you just thought back to a memory that something your friend did that made you laugh, and you think back to that time and you go, no, that made me laugh. And that was such a positive time. I look back in fondness. That's nostalgia. when you look back in positivity. Okay, so two more then. We've got, of course, the ones we've used. Ominous, tension, and sadness. Oh, sorry, we've used ominous. So tension and sad and adventure then. So the floorboards groaned beneath their feet, each creak echoing in the stillness as they moved forward, knowing something or someone was just out of sight. Out of the two that we have left, we have tension and adventure. I think I would pretty obviously mark this one as tension, but why would I do that? Because it's similar to suspense. It's the unknown. It's this creation of a unsettling feelings. As a reader, I'm feeling very unsettled, purely because of the tense atmosphere. I'm feeling unsettled or uncomfortable. So a tense and suspenseful atmosphere will often do that. It will make the reader feel sort of this feeling. It's not right. I feel unsettled reading this, that sort of feeling. So again, the onomatopoeia or the personification of the groaning, the creaking, the stillness, knowing something or someone. So you've got this separate clause that affects the pacing of the sentence to create tension. Okay, so the trail wound steeply up the mountain, disappearing into the thick mist, but with every step forward, the promise of discovery seemed just around the corner. So I would argue this is our adventure one. If you're ever feeling adventurous, you want something new, you want a new experience, you're excited about the future. So again, we've got this idea of symbolism, something representing something else. The thick mist, the promise of discovery around the corner. So something is around the corner. It's almost an idiom for something better coming. So something better around the corner. And the thick mist sort of being our unknown or symbolic of our unknown. And the unknown can be something quite exciting sometimes. It doesn't necessarily have to be a negative thing. Okay, sorry that I'm rushing the end of this, but we've got other things I want to include. Okay, so that's the general basis of our tone and our atmosphere then. Now, the other techniques, and I will highlight here there are 22 of them, not including our tone and atmosphere, that can decide our tone and atmosphere, that can determine them. 3 of them I will begin here. And I've linked these things for a reason. So symbolism, imagery, and semantic fields are 3 techniques that you could write about in your answers. So let's go through why I've linked them. Symbolism, imagery, and semantic fields are closely connected because they all rely on connotations to create deeper meaning and influence how the reader experiences a text. So our connotation is our experiences. How do we feel about the words? What do we think about the words that are used? Symbolism, imagery, and semantic fields all play on this idea of personal experience. So each of these devices uses language that carries emotional or cultural associations beyond the literal. So when I say emotional and cultural associations, I mean, what does the word make us feel and why? What does the word make us think of and why? So imagery, let's start there because it's probably our easier one. I mean, imagery is one of those things that I would argue you could include 90% of the time. The way that I like to teach imagery is if you can see it in your head, it is imagery. If you've ever read a long description about a garden or about the lead up to a house or the weather, it's imagery. That's all imagery. And it's all, if you can see it in your head, it is imagery. So imagery appeals to the senses and paints a vivid mental picture. Hence what I was saying, can you see it in your head? But it's the connotations of the images, what they suggest or evoke emotionally, that shape the tone. So for example, describing a wilted flower may literally create an image of the flower dying if it's wilted, but the connotations beyond the literal or the perceptive is that it's to do with decay, that it's the loss of beauty, the fragility that the reader might be left to feel. The imagery is when you can see something in your head as you read it. This should evoke emotions based on experience. Does that make sense? So imagery is very much description. It's very much, if you can see it in your head and it makes you feel something, that reflects the tone in the atmosphere. Symbolism works in a similar way, using objects, settings, or characters, object setting or characters to represent something larger or the larger themes. So I highlight objects, settings, or characters to represent larger ideas. So for example, a storm might symbolize or represent internal conflict or emotional turmoil, not because it's explicitly stated, but because we associate storms with chaos or danger. So symbolism is when something represents something else. The reader will have an opinion or emotional response to the represented thing based on experience. So for example, I don't know if there are any year 11s in here who sat their GCSE yesterday on Macbeth, but the question was to do with ambition in Macbeth, and the extract was, it is a dagger I see before me. That is a great use of both imagery and symbolism. So the dagger in that context represents or symbolizes ambition or guilt or violence, all of those things. On the literal level, yes, it's a dagger and you can use it to do damage to people, but on a metaphorical, symbolic level, it represents how Macbeth is feeling and about what he's doing. So it symbolizes ambition and violence, danger. You get what I mean? So symbolism is that representation then. So semantic fields, then our final one, are groups of related words on a particular theme. So they build atmosphere by layering these connotations. So a semantic field of darkness, for example, shadow, night, black, murky, all of those words are within a similar genre of words. And they all work to intensify a sense of fear. Together, these techniques subtly shape the emotional landscape of a text, allowing writers to guide the reader's responses without telling them how to feel directly. So to sort of sum up these three then, imagery is, if you can see it in your head, it's imagery. Symbolism is if an object or setting represents something else. So for example, the dagger represents ambition. Yes, on a literal level, it's a weapon, but what does that represent in the context of the soliloquy that Macbeth gives? He's feeling guilty. He's feeling, he's overcome with ambition and power. Therefore, it represents those things. The semantic field is groups of words with a similar genre or feel. So for example, the shadow, night, black, and murky are all to do with darkness. So I've given two, and this is the last thing we'll do. I've given two examples of two different paragraphs that convey a very different tone. And I want you to spot the semantic fields that are in there, the imagery and the symbolism of specific words that guide what tone it is, that tell us the tone and therefore how it makes us feel. Okay, so the first one then. The garden bloomed like a sanctuary, sunlight pouring through the leaves in golden streams that danced on the petals. Lavender and jasmine carried their soft perfume on a warm breeze, each breath a quiet reminder of a happier time. The stone path, gently lined with daisies and forget-me-nots, wound towards a small fountain that whispered in the hush of the morning. Birds sang from hidden branches, their songs threading through the air like lullabies. In each blossom and blade of grass, the garden whispered tranquility, a soft exhale, a cradle of stillness that wrapped itself around their soul like a soft shawl. Ivy curled protectively along the stone wall and beneath the burrows. The earth felt steady and kind, as though the world beyond could not touch this place of quiet refuge. So I'm going to do colours for each one. Let's do sort of yellow for our imagery. Let's do a sort of pink for our symbolism. And let's do a blue for our semantic fields. So there is plenty of these in here. I mean, imagery is pretty much most of it. As I was reading that, you should have been able to see it in your heads. I mean, there's direct Descriptions of the sunlight pouring through the leaves. That's a description of something that's happening. I would argue that's imagery. The golden streams. Can you see it? The gold. Everyone knows what gold looks like. The dancing on the petals. That's imagery. The lavender and jasmine, their soft perfume. All of this, and 90% of this is imagery. I'm going to put 90% imagery because most of it is. If you can see it in your head, you could argue it is imagery. And how does that imagery make you feel? How does it change the tone in the atmosphere? I mean, most of these things I would say is associated with some sort of peace or peaceful response. So if we go with the sunlight pouring through the leaves in golden streams, that imagery is to do with a sort of hopeful tone, similar to what we saw above with the sun moving through the clouds. It gives us an atmosphere or a tone of something that's hopeful, and therefore it makes the reader feel very safe and calm and collected. Our symbolism. There is quite a bit of symbolism. For example, the shawl. Yes, on a literal sense. I mean, it's a simile, but it's saying that the grass is like a shawl. So yes, on a literal sense, we can say the grass feels soft. You know, we put on a shawl. It's made of cotton. It's nice and soft. It's wool. It feels nice against our skin. Yeah, yeah. It's a literal level. But on a more perceptive level, what does that shawl represent? Why do we feel hopeful and safe when we put on a shawl? Because it's about comfort. It's about safety. It's about when we're a kid, we like getting hugs off our parents because it makes us feel safe and loved. And that's the perceptive inference. It's this idea of love and comfort and safety. That these feelings that we associate that remind the reader of childhood. Reader, yeah, it reminds the reader of their childhood. And I would hope that a lot of us have those positive feelings about our childhood that allow this symbolism to sort of come through. Okay. We could also talk about the semantic fields, and I hope that you spotted this semantic field. There's words such as the whispering, the hush, the lullabies, the cradle, anything else? I guess the shawl, very similar. All of these words are linking or emphasize my point about reminding the reader of the childhood, because I would argue all of these words are within a semantic field of childhood. They all, do you get what I mean? The theme here is childhood. The theme is young, like babies almost. We cradle them. We sing them lullabies. We quieten them when they're screaming. All of this is the idea of childhood. So we could write a point evidence explain paragraph that links the symbolism to the semantic field. The shawl is a symbol of safety, of comfort. Yes, it feels nice to put on, but it's that feeling of being in a small place that just, it's like when you get in bed at night, you wrap yourself in the duvet. Why do you do that? Because you know that in your bedroom it's the safe place that you have. Similar with the shawl. So I'm going to put similar to duvet, similar to wrapping in duvet. And so the semantic field is the same thing. The childhood emphasizes our point about reminding the reader of their childhood. And the tone that comes from that is something that's very calm, that's very peaceful. It paints the garden as a serene place. It's a safe place. All of it paints the garden or tells us that the garden is a sanctuary. It is a place that you can come and you are forever safe and protected. It's like a mother cradles their child because our mother protects us from the dangers of the world, very much like this garden protects us. So protects their child like the garden protects us. And that is our perceptive inference. Okay, let me just check the chat. I've kind of been ignoring it, sorry. Yes, this is sort of like year 10 GCSE level. Sorry, again, I will keep an eye on the chat. I've been ignoring it for about 10 minutes. I've been so involved. Okay, so the next one then is a very different tone. The first one paints the garden as a almost like a dojo, as a safe space. Because we link it to our childhood. It reminds us of a happier time. I guess we could also say nostalgic atmosphere. There's nothing threatening here. No threat. Whereas in the next one, we're about to get a very opposite idea of this garden. So the garden had fallen into silence, its once vivid colours dulled by creeping ivy and rot. Wilted roses hung their heads like mourners, their petals browned and brittle. A cracked bird bath, long dry, sat beneath a gnarled tree whose branches clawed at the sky, where clouds gathered in long striated streaks, thin and rigid like bars drawn across the heavens. The wind hissed through hollow stems and empty seed pods, carrying the scent of earth and mildew. Each object seemed a ghost of what it once was. The air was choking thick, clinging to the lips like damp cloth. Still, silent, poised, an assassin of the night. A rusted gate hung ajar at the far edge, swaying slightly, not in invitation, but in warning. A crooked sentinel guarding a place where even time had hung its head in shame. I hope you've spotted as we've gone through this, there are other techniques in here. There's personification, there's metaphors, there's alliteration, there's the sort of fricative lexis, but I want us to focus primarily on imagery, symbolism, and semantic fields. So again, the imagery is a lot of this. The idea that its once vivid colours are dulled. I would argue I can see that in my head. If a colour is dulled, it's probably grey or black or sort of like charred colours. By creeping ivy and rot, this idea of it creeping, that's a personification, and a personification gives the imagery. The imagery here being the idea of creeping makes me think of someone who's trying to get one on me and follow me. So this idea of creeping, is this working? It's not going to work. Yeah, this idea of creeping gives the imagery of almost like an animal, this predatory idea, this predatory imagery. Of being followed. Wilted roses hung their heads like mourners, personification and a simile. But again, let's talk about our symbolism. Yes, on a literal level, we can see it in our heads, the roses are dying. Yeah, on a literal level, they're hanging their heads, tells us that they're dying. But on a symbolic level, let's focus on this idea of the mourner. When people mourn, what do? It's because of death. They're celebrating or being sad because they've lost somebody. So we've got this idea of the mourner being represent or symbolic of death, of something that once was, and therefore that creates a tone of something that's almost ominous or grief, sort of grief tone or ominous. I would argue either or. Because, so you see what I'm saying? The tone and the atmosphere come from our associations. Because I've associated it with death, I've used my personal experiences with death to realize, oh, this is actually quite a sad and scary thing, because that's how I felt reading those words. So, again, we've got loads more imagery. We've got the long striated bars of the heavens. I can see that in my head. I would argue that's imagery. We've got the alliteration of the striated streaks, the simile of like bars drawn across the heavens. That is imagery. And I think, again, kind of links to our predatory imagery, this idea of entrapment. I'd say that is even symbolism, that the striations almost represent this feeling of being trapped. And if we were to build the tone off of this, imagine if somebody trapped you in a basement, how would you feel? I mean, I personally would be very scared. I'd be unsettled. I'd be extremely frightened. I'd be terrified even. So this feeling of being trapped behind bars created by the symbolism gives a tone that is very unsettling. Unsettling tone. And something, the atmosphere, I would argue, is ominous or sinister. I mean, if something is sinister, it's out there to get you, it's out there to do you harm. So I would argue that those associations tell me that it is a sinister atmosphere. Okay, let's pick out some more symbolism. A quick 5 minutes, and then we'll wrap everything up. The chokingly thick, the cloth represents, again, we kind of link this idea of the cloth over the lips. Again, this very sinister image. I mean, if someone were to sort of put a cloth over your lips, it gives the imagery of this attack imagery, or imagery of attack, which symbolizes something dangerous. It tells us that therefore the garden is a violent force. See how I'm kind of building? We started with the imagery. I associate it with danger, therefore it makes me feel unsettled. It tells me, therefore, that the garden is a violent force. Okay, let's finish on the semantic field then, because I would argue emphasizes our point. There is this idea of the assassin, the cloth, the mourners. See, there is also, I mean, this there's multiple semantic fields. I would argue that semantic field one is idea of danger, the assassin who wants to kill us, the mourners linking to death, the cloth of something that's violent, all of this sort of violent, death-related imagery, semantic field of violence or death, something out in the dark wanting to get us, the idea of the warning, that's all within the same semantic field, which adds to our idea that this garden is a violent and threatening force because I have associations with those words as being violent, which therefore scares me as the reader and makes me feel unsettled. And then finally, there is one more semantic field to do with like decay. There is the wilting, the hung, their heads. There is the brittle and cracked. Where they are, but there's brittle and cracked, and all of those are within the same semantic field of sort of decay. So let me highlight the turn. Semantic field 2 is idea of decay. And when something decays, it is because it is losing life. It is in death. So therefore, makes me feel uncertain and unsettled and fearful. Therefore, telling me and supporting my idea that this garden is presented as a sinister force. Okay. Right. So that kind of brings us to a nice close then. I'm not sure how we wanted to end this.
Fine, we'll start together.
Cool.
And that'll just end it here. So we'll just go to.